Hello and welcome to the 18 group webinar on last minute preparations for SFTR, what still needs to be done and are we ready? My name is Laurie McCautry. I'm the editor at 18 Group and I am delighted to welcome our panelists for today's webinar. We have Thomas Pickett, Vice President of Agencies, Securities, Lending and Product Development at JP Morgan, Daud Hack, Global Lead for Regulatory Market Initiatives, Transformation and Strategy at Deutsche Bank, Lance Reese, Director of Product Management at S&P Global Market Intelligence, and Linda Kaufman of the EVP Reference Data Utility, SmartStream RDU. I'm sure you're all familiar with 18 Group webinars, but I will tell you a little bit about the resources we offer and the events we have coming up over the next few months towards the end of the session. But in the meantime, let's get back to our guest speakers. So Thomas, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your expertise as it relates to SFTR?
Hi, yeah, of course. So, Tom Pickett, I'm responsible for the SFTR program at JP Morgan on the agency securities lending side. My background is primarily around regulatory reporting, so having been at JP Morgan since March last year. Prior to that, I was responsible for the SFTR product at Trax, where we were collaborating with Equilend. Prior to that, I was responsible for running the BAU teams associated with MiFID, EMIR, and Dodd-Frank reporting at NatWest Markets. So my experience is primarily on the regulatory reporting side. However, over the last year, I've been spending a significant amount of time, obviously, on the securities lending aspects associated with SFTR.
Wonderful, thank you. And Daud, let's come to you.
Yeah, hi. So it's Daud Hack, Global Lead for Regulatory Market Initiatives. So what does that mean? It means that where I am responsible for scanning the regulatory horizon, in particular in the post-trade space globally, to identify upcoming new regulations and changes to in-flight regulations, identifying what is the delta between the current and the future state that we require, and giving an initial impact assessment for the firm in that location, or if it's extraterritorial globally, obviously. Beyond that, I work on standards with the industry. I attend IST 12, which is a UK financial ISO committee. On behalf of UK Finance, we roll up into TC 68, which is the global standards setting body for the financial industry. I'm an industry observer at the FSB, Financial Stability Board, as well as an expert, a regulatory expert and banking expert for CPA Moscow. On top of that, I am a member of multiple committees at our trade associations across AFME, ISDA, ICMA, ISLA, and GFMA. And then I'm also represent our firm in conversations with our regulators. Now, with regards to SFTR, I've been working on SFTR since it was first muted in ESMA, and so working closely with the regulator and with our industry peers on building a solution for the industry as a whole. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And Lance, what's your interest in SFTR?
Hi, and thank you. Yeah. So my name is Lance, and I've been working with Standard & Poor's for 20+ years and building a comprehensive security and entity level security master file cross-reference solution, which is critical towards SFTR and other regulatory initiatives as we bring data sets together and help customers be more compliant.
Wonderful. And Linda, finally, let's come to you.
Thanks, Lauren, for the introduction. I have been in the reference data space for a bit longer than I'd like to admit, so I'm not throwing numbers out there. A good chunk of my time was spent in the fixed income world, but over the last 5 years or so, I've become much more focused on the regulatory space. I currently run the SmartStream reference data utility business, and we recently rolled out an SFTR product, and thus I've been quite involved with the industry over the last year, meeting with customers, trade associations, regulators, etc., to really get down to the needs of the industry on the SFTR front. And so I'm really looking forward to the conversation today on a topic that definitely seems to be front and center for many.
Fantastic. Great. Well, thank you to all of our speakers, and we have a fantastic lineup today. Before we begin, I'm just going to go through a quick outline of what we hope to cover. It's a lot of material. I will also give our listeners the chance to answer a number of brief polls to collate industry insight. And don't forget that if you have a question, you can submit it at any time. We have a lot of material to cover, but I will do my best to direct that to the right speaker at the right time to answer it for you. Okay, so our talking points for today, we are going to start off by going over the preparations for SFTR and the most urgent elements to focus on. We'll look at the complexity of reporting requirements, including the new reference data fields, security rating and tracing concerns over LEI coverage gaps, delays around industry testing and how to future-proof against that, direct versus delegated reporting and licensing requirements for third-party data, how rigorous we expect the regulators to be around reporting and compliance when the regulation does kick off, and the biggest pitfalls to watch out for and key challenges to address in advance of implementation. So we're going to get going in just a minute, but before we start, can we set the scene with a quick audience poll? So listeners, can you please tell us how prepared your firm currently is for the implementation of SFTR in April? The answers are very prepared, quite prepared, or unprepared, and we have 20 seconds for you to answer. So it looks as if 72%, so about 3/4 say that you're quite prepared, and 21% is unprepared. So that's pretty interesting to kick us off. So if we go to the first question, where should firms be in their preparations for SFTR, and what are the most urgent elements they should be focusing on? Where should their priorities lie? Daud, I'm going to let you take the lead on this one.
Okay, so, wow, I am reasonably by the outcome.
I'm sorry, Daud, are you still there? I think that we have a little issue with Daud's sound. So Linda, if you're there, maybe we can move to you.
Sure. So again, from my introduction, we really have a focus on the reference data space. So I will kick off talking about that. From our conversations that we've had with most firms, it appears that they started with the plumbing. So how do we get their data transmitted to the TRs? And then secondly, they started looking at where they get the data that they need to push through that plumbing. So hopefully, and from our conversations, it appears that most people have the basics of that plumbing complete. So they either have delegated the reporting or have the infrastructure built to report themselves. But what we're finding is that they are now scrambling to look at the data content and ensuring that the delegated reporter are addressing data accuracy concerns and implementing a data exception framework. So I think that really the most urgent element that they should be focusing on is around, now that you have your plumbing, maybe just a tactical fix, but you have something in place. Now start looking at, really be entrenched in the UAT process and making sure that now that I have the plumbing and I'm able to, hopefully generate a report, what does that report contain? And some of the conversations that we're having, I don't think there was enough of appreciation around some of the complexities on some of the fields. So I think that that's where firms really need to be at a point where they're really evaluating, not only can I report, but what am I reporting?
Mm-hmm. Okay, and we're going to move on to the next question while we're waiting for Daud to come back online. And that is, obviously, as I'm sure we're all aware, SFTR is extensive. There are some 150 data fields. in its mandatory regulatory reports. So introducing the kind of transaction reporting practitioners may have experienced already via the MiFIR and EMIR regulations. How should this level of detail impact firms' approach to compliance? What needs to be done differently compared to previous regulations? And I'm going to throw that one over to you, Lance. Can you talk us through this?
Sure, absolutely. I think one of the key things is to really focus more on standardization of data fields, which is key. And and for this particular requirement, there's hundreds or just over 100 data attributes that are required, and we can get these different attributes from different vendors, different providers, but when we standardize them, they become more consistent. So if you look at, for example, if you're trying to identify a particular instrument and you want to use ISO CFI code to specify that this is a fixed income security or it's a commodity, etc., those are going to be critical and should be there should be a key focus on that, the standardization. And I think, we look at this slide here, I've got this picture of hopefully everybody's figured out who it is, but if you can tell what you want to achieve, but if you're pulling it from different sources, it becomes a little pixelated. And so this picture, if you haven't figured out, it's Tom Hanks. I've pulled it from 4 different pictures of Tom, and by putting it together from 4 different sources, you can kind of figure out what it is, but because it's not the coming from the same picture, it's not standardized, it becomes a little unclear. So that's going to be critical, I think, as we move forward in this direction. And I think that's one of the key things that needs to be different than what we've seen in the past.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and would you like me to move on to your next slide, Lance? I know you have 2.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I think, data sources together so that you do have, Linda just mentioned plumbing, but I think first you need a good, strong foundation. And having a strong security and comprehensive entity master file cross-reference solution. Not only do you require the LEI or ISIN numbers, it's important to have the other identifiers that are associated with these entities, these companies, in the event that something is missing or not available. Perhaps there's an institution that doesn't have complete coverage yet of ISIN numbers or even the LEIs, but there needs to be another way to make that link. And I think Standard & Poor's Market Intelligence, we have done a really good job over the last 20 plus years in building this comprehensive solution to address not only SFTR but other regulatory requirements. And I think a lot of our clients and other integrators, for example, have come to us as sort of a key component in building out these requirements and to really make that a seamless process.
Okay, and we're gonna move on to discussing that reference data requirement in a little more detail coming up. But first, we've had a few questions come through from the audience, and before we move to the next question, I just want to throw those out to our panel. So the first is, are daily variation cash collateral data, such as in the case of a simple repo, required to be reported on a daily basis, similar to EMIR? And if so, which template must be used? Is it the SFT COLU template?
Yeah, it's a COLU.
It's
absolutely.
the COLU.
Yeah,
okay.
It is, and you have to update it. So I apologise. My headset died, and so I've had to rush into a separate room. So I'm back. And you do have to report daily any changes to the collateral.
Okay, so there's a few more. We're going to try and get through them really quickly before we move on so that our audience get the answers they want. The next question, in the case of a plain vanilla repo, must both the repo counterparty and the reverse repo counterparty perform the reuse reporting? Does anybody want to take that one? Okay, I think we're gonna, if no one's quite sure on that, I think we're gonna leave that one for now. We can always return to it.
Reuse, you wouldn't be using the reuse, I don't believe, report there. You'd be using new as the instrument type for a repo. and both parties to that repo would have to, whether you're the buyer or the seller, reports the same, which is a new, because it's dual-sided reporting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I hope that answers your question to the listener that sent that question in. We have another couple here about SFTR security types, MiQ. We have concerns over the classification of the fee liable constituents as MiQ when the vendor has no rights to expose such classification, as it is a contract breach with the main index owners.
Can you repeat that? Because I think this is something that I'm going to touch on in a second too, but I don't know if I heard the whole question.
Okay, so we have, no problem, Linda. We have concerns over the classification of the fee liable constituents as MiQ when the vendor has no rights to expose such classification, as it is a contract breach with the main index owners.
Correct. So I think we get into that on the next slide if you want to just flip over on the next question.
You know what, let's leave it there then, and we'll shoot over to the next slide so that Linda can elaborate on this in more detail. First, we're just going to have another quick poll to bring us into this next section. How are you planning to compile, enrich, and validate data from your firm's internal systems for SFTR reporting? And the answers are: we have built our own in-house solution, you're modifying or upgrading an existing system, you have selected and confirmed a third-party vendor, or you have not yet decided how you will manage and report under SFTR. And again, you have about 15 seconds to answer that. So if we close that, it looks as if about 40% built your own in-house and about 40% are going with a third-party vendor. So Linda, I'm going to move over to you. What challenges have you seen in the process of gathering, identifying and closing any gaps in coverage and enriching this data so that it meets the quality criteria of the regulation? Is the industry where it needs to be? So Linda, over to you.
Thanks. So you'll hear me say over and over again, probably during this webinar, that from a reference data perspective, the two most troubling fields are security type and security quality. So as the person who just sent in that question, for security type, one of the concerns is actually for both fields, there is a licensing element to this. So first and foremost, I know this slide, the first talk seems very rudimentary, right? But we're still getting questions in from the industry, which leads us to believe that there are still fields, especially in the security type, security quality area, where people don't know where they're going to get their data from. So they're still trying to sort through. If you looked at the security type very quickly when SFTR first came out, when the guidance and the technical specifications first came out, it seemed pretty basic, right? From a reference data perspective in particular, there was only a handful of fields. But then when you started to dive in, which I think, again, people looked at the plumbing first. Oh my gosh, I have to reconcile. I have all these fields. I have to gather all this data. I have to report to the TR. And they looked at that piece and said, okay, the reference data aspect looks pretty easy. I'll worry about that later. But when they came back, started looking under the covers, they realized that there's some indirect sets of data, such as index constituents, which was just mentioned, such as ratings possibly, depending on how you're approaching security quality, industry classifications that are needed. So I think at a basic level, firms really need to figure out, where am I sourcing that data from? Do I have access to all of those sets of data? And do I need, back to what Lance was talking about, do I need to cross-reference between internal and external systems, which is always where everybody kind of stumbles a bit. But from a licensing perspective, which is the question you were just reading, there is definitely a concern about licensing. So I can only speak about our product in depth, but we had to go out and get the right licensing in order to be able to derive that security type for our clients. And that goes the same with how we approach security quality. We are great partners with S&P, and so we had to work with them to sort through that licensing as well. And I think that we asked, I will not rat on anybody and mention names, but we did ask somebody who was delegating and counting on a third party to enrich and hadn't asked the question of licensing or additional fees. And I think that that's a scary place to be. So I would really highlight to people, please ask if you have, you know, although I would like everybody to be RDU clients, no matter who your third party is, if you're delegating enrichment, ask about licensing, because you do not want to find yourself in a bad position a few months from now that you are non-compliant with usage of data. We raised back to the question, we raised with the regulator on multiple occasions the fact that the equity security type was going to lead to additional costs, because you need access to those index providers, and we don't think that we got an answer that was very helpful or helped address the concerns of especially the smaller firms that don't necessarily have access to that data as of yet. So I think it's still an issue. I don't think it was necessarily addressed. I actually think there's room in that area to do an industry collaboration. I think if the index providers got together and made that data available, I think that would be a great opportunity for the industry to come together. But as of now, that hasn't happened, and so we, from a personal, from the RDU perspective, we've had to go out and get licensing and ensure that our users are compliant. So licensing for sure. So I hope I answered that question. And then exception management is the third.
Just to interject there, by the way, we do have a sort of scheduled question on licensing coming up a little bit later in the webinar, so there'll be the chance to elaborate on that a little bit further going forward.
Wonderful. And then the only last piece I would say about the overall enriching, et cetera, is that we know that a big part of SFTR, which is different than some of the other regulations, is the reconciliation. And I'm not sure that everyone is given enough thought around making sure you have the support model to support all of the conflicts, right? So all of this data that you're getting enriched, whether it be from internal systems or from third parties, what are the chances that you're going to match? There's issues with CFI coverage in certain regions. There is people are deriving security quality differently, et cetera, and so forth. So I think you need to make sure that you have a support system in place so that to handle that influx of exceptions.
Okay, brilliant. And now I'm going to, like I said, we're gonna circle back onto that licensing issue a little bit later. I'm going to try. I'm sorry, it's not all entirely flowing perfectly, but I want to make sure that our audience get their questions answered. To our listeners, when you're directing a question, would you be able to just add the person, if you know the speaker that you're directing that question to, and then if for any reason we don't manage to get through all of the questions in the webinar today, we will be able to pass that on to the speaker and hopefully follow up with you at a later date and make sure that everything gets organized afterwards. So I'm going to just go through a couple more questions. One person is asking, what does net exposure in the new trade template refer to? Does this mean the net MTM per counterparty per agreement or on a trade level?
That's problematic, right? So it's supposed to be trade level, but most mark-to-markets are now done at portfolio level. So it's very hard to say that it should be. Different firms are taking different approaches of what they put in that field, to be honest. There's a best practice from ICMA on it, and I think it's supposed to be, if it's done at a portfolio level, then you put the same value on every trade that's within that portfolio, the same value, and if it's at trade level, then just put trade level mark-to-market value on it.
Okay. Now, the CCP margin template is required to be used only by counterparties involved in clearing. For uncleared repos, is it correct that this is not required?
Cannot give regulatory advice.
Okay, fair enough. That's a good answer. Lance, there's a quick question for you before we move on. Can you please explain what is GICRS, because the picture was a little funny, and how can that help SFTR?
Yeah, absolutely. So GICRS is the Global Instrument Cross-Reference Service. So that's the instrument level, or AKA security master file, with the instrument level IDs from the NNAs, the national numbering agents that are governed under ANA. plus other additional identifiers from different institutions. And to that point, I did want to address the third bullet here under data. Do institutions need cross-reference? And the answer is absolutely, right? If we want to build the best of breed, especially to address the requirements within the SFTR, you're going to want from different providers, and some providers do different components better than others. Certainly, as we talk about LEIs, UTI, and the ISIN number. And I think one of the other important pieces, and I just want to highlight this, the NNA that assigns that ISIN is also required to assign the CFI, which is really a security type identifier. So again, a key component to this regulation that is addressed in that piece. So hopefully that helps. And by the way, the other piece, if you didn't see it, was BECRS, which is for business entity cross-reference. So the key thing here is cross-reference, but one is entity level. The other piece, Gickers, is the instrument level.
Okay, great. And we have one more question. Well, we have a couple of questions, but they're very similar. So I'm just going to scoot through these before we move on to the next question. Are daily valuations similar to EMIR are not required to be reported in the case of plain vanilla repos and are only required for SL trades? Is this correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, great. And would we report with action type MODI if we were undertaking a partial return for a stock borrow, and that's directed at Dowd?
Yes, we just had that discussion at ESMA actually last week, and the answer is yes.
Okay, well that is a nice way to end the question.
Unless you disagree, Tom.
All I was going to say is that I think there was some ambiguity put into the guidelines that came out on the 6th, which basically suggested that it could be that you would have to modify it to a term trade, which is kind of proving very contentious and something that we pushed back to ESMA on. I mean, certainly the best practice that's coming out of ISLA, the steer code that I sit on, is that in that instance we would absolutely use a MODI and then an ETRM if it was terminated. So yeah, I think like Dowd has correctly said, I think it is kind of become contentious when it didn't need to be, I don't think.
Well, this goes back to the question 1, which unfortunately I got cut off during, is what the firms need to be focusing on since up to the go live date. The problem is, as Thomas just articulated, ESMA brought out their guidance on the 6th of January. Most firms had already completed their builds by that date, most of the big SFTR firms. And so most of that guidance cannot be incorporated into people's design now. And so either they'll be seen as day 2 issues, or we will go along with the industry best practice papers, which have been published by ISLA and ICMA, and then rely on group advocacy post go live to say, this is how it works, this is how we do it, and your guidance needs to be changed. So okay. I think that's where we'll get to.
Great. Okay, and now I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move us on. I'm sorry, we're dotting around a little bit, but we're going to get back on track now and move to the next topic, which is on the subject of security and collateral quality. So there has been some debate among practitioners as to how best to address this issue. Are we any closer to a decision on whether a rating from a recognized agency will suffice? And if not, what are the alternatives? Lance, you're the obvious man for this one, so I'm going to pass that back to you.
Sure, and I think at this point, I think the rating is really the answer, because I'm not sure what the other alternatives are. I think with all the modifications to the rating agencies over the last several years and the policies that they need to follow, that becomes a suitable option, in my opinion. And I think, when trying to identify investment grade for a particular instrument type, I think the ratings help us provide additional details, whether it's a long term or short term. You're looking at local currency or foreign currency. All of these different things help us address this particular requirement.
Okay, great. And
Lauren,
then,
sorry, Lauren, can I just add something really quick?
Of course.
So I'm in agreement with Lance. I think ESMA didn't help us, right, with this, because every time that they tried to come back with more guidance on this particular one, it was very wishy-washy, right? So well, we're not mandating that you use a rating agency, but as long as you're in agreement with your counterparty, blah, blah, blah. But if you think about how many fields the counterparties have to reconcile against, and the volume of transactions that they're dealing with, it's crazy to think that they're going to use something that's not standard. My worry is that if they use different standards across different rating agencies, right, then the reconciliation is going to be a bit of a problem. So it'll be interesting to see how firms roll out this. But I totally agree with Lance that it feels like that's a great area for standardization and to use similar sources.
Okay.
So can I join in as well? On the future necessarily rather than the now, I'm involved at the European Commission with an initiative called the Fitness Check, where we are reviewing all of the regulatory reporting regimes across the European Union. SFTR, unfortunately, because it hadn't gone live yet, was not in the initial scope of that fitness check. It was seen as something that would be reviewed post go live, but certainly would join that process of being reviewed. And one of the things that has come out of fitness check so far is regulators need to start using a lot of the industry standards. So we use rating agency data, as Lance has already articulated very, very well, in lots of our decision making today. And same with like red IDs, et cetera, et cetera. There are lots of industry standards which we have built and maintain in order to do this work. So regulators will now start to lean into that and start to use it. But in order to do so, they may have to get them ISO compliant. So that's something you'll see on the horizon coming soon is, yes, we will be probably adopting those standards, but those standards will have to be changed and modified to make them compliant with global standards.
Okay, right, and then we're going to move on. Similarly, just to quickly move on to the next question. The requirement to provide the LEI of the issuer of any given security has also posed problems, particularly for securities issued outside of the EU. ESMA announced a last-minute reprieve on this in January with a 12-month grace period for the reporting of LEI codes from third-country issuers. Dowd, I'm going to ask you again, is this going to help, and does it go far enough given the current gaps in LEI coverage?
So I sit on the SIGI, which is the Systemically Important Bank group that advises the GLIF, who own the LEI network. And in their strategy 2.0, they're absolutely looking to grow the LEI, and not only beyond its current the current users, so increase the number of market participants globally who do that, but also the number of use cases in which it works. Now, at the moment, over the last year and a half, I think it's about a year and a half, if you are an issuer of a new security that is listed on an exchange in the UK, you need an LEI in order to do so. Now, the problem, though, is we have a history of issuance of securities from issuers who do not have LEIs. Those issuers who do not have an LEI and have no intention of issuing any more securities have no benefit case from adopting an LEI. Okay, and that's the problem the industry faces. We, an estimate by not by my firm, but a very peer of ours, did on their collateral reports, found that in some cases 90% of the underlying collateral would not be able to be reported if the LEI became a mandatory field, which makes the collateral reporting meaningless, right? So 12 months is not long enough because the problem will not go away. But what it does show is that ESMA has listened to the industry and has taken on board the advocacy by ICMA, ISLA, AFME, etc. And I've realised there is a problem here. The solution isn't a delay. The solution is to remove the obligation.
Okay, and we've.
Yeah, I think I think I'd also add that the LEI of issuer delays obviously only on third countries. I think ISLA published a couple of days ago the work that they've been looking at for. Basically, they've got all of the instruments from around 10 of their members which do not have an LEI. Actually, 13% of those are EU issuers. So we still have a problem for April that people need to be mindful of. And also be aware that if you have an instrument within your collateral report that you send down that does not have an LEI, the way the validations work at the trade repository, they will reject in its entirety that collateral file. So even though you might have 100,000 rows of collateral in there, if you have one row which doesn't have an LEI for the issuer, it will kick out the whole file, meaning that you wouldn't be able to successfully submit that, and so you have to strip that out and then send it down. So this is something that, as Dowd has already mentioned, we've gone through a significant amount of advocacy through the associations to put pressure on ESMA to make sure that they are aware of this issue. I think there's two things to be mindful of: the EU issuer element, which is still out there, and the second is the validation rules at the trade repository make this problem a lot worse than it needs to be.
And we can back up those numbers, right? So we did a similar UAT with a client, looked at their collateral, and it was about, I was pretty shocked actually, I have to say, that it was almost 20% in our case that they were EU issuers that did not have that LEI. So it is going to cause a bit of a problem because it's not, ESMA didn't go wide enough, I don't think, with the exemption.
So we have a couple of questions from the audience.
Yeah, can I just add to that though, real quick, if it's okay? So I think the LEI is a critical component, and hopefully folks do get on board and comply. But to the point about instruments that are listed on exchanges for companies who no longer intend to, add new ones, that's why, again, it's key to have a solid cross-reference solution where if that institution doesn't, we can quickly identify which ones don't have the LEIs because the ISIN is going to be available. And it's key to have other identifiers that you can still map or basically bridge that gap where there isn't an LEI. Sorry.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions from the audience that we're going to answer really, really quickly before we move on. First, one member wants to know, what is a UTI, a unique trade identifier, and how is it determined?
Right. So UTI was created by CPA Moscow. I sat in those meetings. CPA Moscow is a group of international regulators, right? Unique transaction identifier comes from the G20 commitments made back in 2008. And basically what they wanted to do is to do systemic risk aggregation cross-border, and the only way to do that is if every single trade report that's made has an identifier which is unique to itself. Now, when you are dual reporting, so both sides of the transaction need to report, they share a single UTI between them, and that's used in the pairing process at the trade repository, and that means that they can also remove duplicates. So that's what the UTI is.
Okay, and then the next question is,
sorry, before you go on, that's very, the underlying question there is that you and your counterparty in SFTR have to work on a solution to share that UTI between the two of you. Mm-hmm. And that is one of the big industry problems that we face today. It's the timely exchange of that UTI and knowing who is the generator and who is the receiver, and how, what format and what medium you're going to use to do that exchange.
Okay, we're going to have to move on very quickly. Final question, are LEIs of the issuers expected to remain as a mandatory field, especially if these are from non-third-party countries? What action can be done in the absence of an available LEI of an issuer for such cases?
The question of the day.
Yes, so with the expectation it's going to be managed, I think all of the things that Dowd has mentioned. Now, there are certain standards that the regulators have to adhere to that come down from the FSB, and so the LEI is one of those. And so I'm not expecting it to go away. I think the fact that we've had some reprieve from ESMA is positive, and there is an open for us to potentially have that extended, but I wouldn't hold my breath for that. I think what I would advise is speak to your NCAs, speak to ESMA, and make them aware of the concerns that you also have with it. I think the more noise that is created back for those parties will make them kind of understand what the issue is. But I mean, given their latest response, it seems as though they are listening, as Dowd has already mentioned.
Okay.
Yeah. So just to add to that, very briefly, you have different alternatives, right? Now, we're not allowed, I'm certainly not allowed for my firm, and I'm sure Tom's in a similar position from his, we're not allowed to give regulatory advice on what is the appropriate alternative to use. But the industry as a whole has come up with several different alternatives, and no one is coalescing around, or the industry is not coalescing around one solution. One is to strip the collateral out of the collateral reports that doesn't have an LEI. So if you have 100 lines and 2 of those lines do not have an LEI, you remove those 2 lines and report the rest of the collateral. Other firms have decided that they will report the whole 100 lines and have the whole message rejected, and then they just log that it was rejected and why it was rejected. And so if there's a regulatory inquiry, they're able to show that they tried to report it, but because of the rules and because there was no LEI there, they're not able to get that report through. Others, more contentiously, are looking to create dummy LEIs. Now, I would advise that is probably the worst solution.
Agree.
But there are people out there who have seriously considered creating these dummy LEIs that don't exist, but follow the format and length, etc. And so we're past the LEI validation level at the first level for this particular report. So they're the 3 different solutions that I've heard of so far.
Okay.
This highlights the need for data. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm just here. We're running out of time, so we're going to have to move on. Linda, do you want to just add whatever you want to say super quick?
No, I was just going to say this highlights the fact that you need to get your exception management and your data analysis, and your data content overview and have a good understanding of that, as we mentioned earlier, so that you know what shape you're going into this regulation with.
And obviously the LEIs are a huge and fairly controversial issue around SFTR. So there's a lot of conversation to be had about that, but we are going to have to move on and look at some of the other issues, one of which is that there have been numerous delays in the publication of the required ISO registered XML schemas from ESMA that have held up the implementation of testing and contributed to concerns around the costs and the problems that could arise if further amendments to the reporting templates are introduced. What challenges, and I'm going to throw that to Tom to begin with, what challenges have these delays presented to affected firms, and what should they be doing to try and future-proof against further changes?
Sure, thank you. So I think first off, there's no getting away from the fact that with SFTR in general, whether it's the ISO standards or the guidelines, we are getting information relatively close to the deadline for reporting in pretty much all aspects that are related to SFTR. I think the challenges with the ISO schema, there's a number. One of them is that they don't necessarily correlate precisely with what the regulators have within their own schema, which is a challenge. So, for example, within the ISO schema, there are multiple currency fields where you could populate for a loan currency and a market currency, whereas in the schema for the regulators, there is only one. So it looks like when ISO, with the schema, as you look at it, it looks as though they are future-proofing some of those fields. But I think one of the things that we have certainly done from an agency lending standpoint is we are utilizing the pyramid market solution, and which is public information. And one of the benefits I've found with using them is that actually that does insulate us from some of the changes that are made by whether it's validations at trade repositories, whether it's ISO schemas. And so there is an element of, if you do use a third party, then you are insulated. The flip side of that particular coin is you obviously are beholden on them implementing things correctly. And so if you're as a firm that's inclined to want to manage that all yourself, then you would build that yourself. And so that's why 40% of the firms on this call have decided to build them themselves. So I think what can firms do to future-proof themselves? I think really it is a case of making sure that you're engaged with the relevant ISO forums, making sure you're engaged with the association forums, speaking to your vendors if you've chosen to use them, and making sure that they're also part of these groups, because as with anything, it is about knowing what is going to come down the road, and a huge amount of advocacy has been carried out as part of SFTR, and it's in a lot of the changes that have been made, it is as a direct result of that advocacy. So I think the problems that it presents is that it has delayed testing, I think, for some firms, which is a problem. And I think when we first started talking about SFTR testing, we were looking at a long run-in of 6 months industry testing. The reality is it's much shorter, and in the main, that is down to this kind of late delivery of schemas, validations, and guidelines.
Okay, fine. And let's do a quick audience poll again before we move on. I'm sorry we didn't circle back to that before, but let's just check with the audience. In terms of reference data, do you already have a trusted source of reference data for SFTR, and the only options are yes and no. I'll keep that open for 15 seconds. About 78% say yes, they do already have a trusted source of reference data, which is reassuring. So let's move on to the next question, which is, given all of those delays, and Tom, you gave us a really good rundown of that, given all of those delays, such as the validation rules, we didn't see the level 3 guidelines yet, do you think, and I think I know the answer that you're going to give on this one, but is an April deadline realistic for firms for SFTR compliance? Dowd, what do you think?
Tom, you go first. Go for it.
Thank you, Dad. So I think there's two answers, right? One is, the regulation going to move? Absolutely not. April is the deadline, and will continue to be the deadline. There's going to be no movement on that. Is the deadline realistic for firms to implement every change that's been implemented, that's been brought in as a result of the guidelines? I think, as Dowd has already mentioned earlier on the call, it's safe to say no, I don't think it is. I think there are certain complexities and certain things that simply we're struggling to make sense of. That is it realistic for a firm to meet all of those by the April deadline? I think there may be a struggle. Dowd, do you agree with that?
Completely. I think, I think it was Linda who said it earlier. I apologise if it wasn't, but basically, you're going to have to start to create a gaps list. An issue list, a list of things that you will be non-compliant with on the day that you start reporting, right? You need to maintain that list, put in a set of reasons for why you have those in place. And one of the main reasons that we will have in place is because of the ambiguity in the regulation and the late release of guidance. So, and every firm is going to be in the same spot.
Right.
But
now,
no, there absolutely will be no delay.
All right, so no delay, but maybe a few teething problems, and we can get to that in the summary at the end of the call. I'm going to move as quickly on. I'm aware that we only have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to move as quickly on to discuss reporting channels. There've been some discussion around the issue of delegated reporting. So a very brief rundown. Dowd and Linda, I'm going to let you two take this one. But what are the pros and cons of each option? Can you give us a quick rundown?
Linda, do you want to go first?
Sure. So, I mean, I think that Tom mentioned, you know, protecting yourself from changes, and especially in the SFTR space, I think that if your delegated reporter is also doing some pre-reconciliation processes for you, that's always a benefit. I can't emphasize enough how much you cannot bury your head in the sand, although, because ESMA has made it clear, not just with this regulation, but other regulations, that it's ultimately the responsibility of the firm as far as data quality and content. So although delegating can be cost effective, and you know, I'm a fan of delegating, obviously, from where I'm sitting right now. But I just think it's super important that you do the right due diligence to make sure that the right oversight is around, especially the data enrichment, exception management, et cetera, and to understand how and where any of the data is being enriched is coming from, as discussed previously. So pros are cost effectiveness and future proofing yourself to changes. In our instance, if the security type changes, our users don't have to worry about that, right? So I think that's clear, that's the pros. The cons are widespread, but in the reference data space in particular, it's really about owning the responsibility of the data content and quality.
Okay, and Dowd, would you agree with that?
Wow, so it's an interesting view there, because obviously I'm in a firm that would be supplying the reporting on behalf of a third party, right? So, or the other parties to the trade. So it was interesting to hear from a person who would delegate rather than a person who is delegated to. Okay, so there's two things here that we need to, three things actually that we need to discuss here. Firstly, from the 11th of January 2021, NFC minuses need to begin starting reporting under SFTR. Now, NFCs, sorry, that was NFCs, not just minuses, plus and minus. But NFCs will be given, there is a mandatory obligation for the counterparty to an NFC to report on behalf of both parties, okay? So there's some delegated reporting we will not have a choice on doing. We must provide it anyway, but it's not delegated, it's mandatory. The second thing to think about is in which business you're in. So, for example, in the stock loan business, delegated reporting is going live from the 13th of April, right? Because their business has already said that they will provide reporting on behalf of borrowers. So it's so there's some flavors already there in place. Now there are some very large challenges with supplying delegated reporting for clients. Okay, the information exchange needed in advance of reporting on behalf of your counterparty, especially in things like collateral and reuse, is going to be extremely difficult because we don't have that data as a reporting firm. And in fact, I would argue it's a lot like MiFID too, where there was again a question around would we do delegated reporting. The firms that typically want to delegate their reporting are normally the AFMs, the asset managers and the hedge funds, right? Very large, sophisticated funds like that, and they have hundreds of thousands of funds. The problem is that the data that they would be required to give us is market sensitive. And unless we could segregate that data and put it behind a Chinese wall and say there is no way that anybody else in the firm could view this data that you're providing to us that we're then going to use in this reporting, if I was on the buy side, I would not be willing to provide that data. And I haven't yet heard of a firm that provides delegated reporting having such a Chinese walled garden in which a client can provide that kind of data and then it be used purely in reporting, so only technology people can see it. So I don't really see there'll be much uptake in the voluntary delegated reporting market in SFTs. That's just the view.
Dad, I think I would add to that from an agent from where we sit, right? So for April, we're sharing data with borrowers to allow them to report, but then our client base is all buy side, as you can imagine. And as their agent lender, we have pretty much all agent lenders on the street actually are going to be offering delegated reporting because as agent lenders, we hold all the data, we hold the collateral base. And so I think that sort of approach for delegated reporting makes sense because we hold all the data anyway and the client isn't actually executing the trades and we are acting as their agent. But I think I agree in terms of what you're talking about where it's that classic kind of EMIR delegated reporting where it's the counterparty on the other side providing the reporting rather than an agent sat in the middle. I think that becomes a challenge.
And that's absolutely right, Tom. I agree with that completely. The other model that you've just reminded me of actually in reporting is a lot of people are onboarding to Equilentrax or Market Pyram as their solution, and both those vendor solutions offer a reporting service as well. Now, obviously, the benefits of going through a platform like that is both sides of trade are on that platform, and then they can match the trade in advance of reporting it, so that there is a process by which you can get a UTI generated by that platform as well. So there are different in SFTR. To Tom's point, there are many different flavors of delegated reporting or reporting on behalf of another party, which aren't available in any other regulation. So
correct, and that's the one I was
much wider offering.
Okay,
that was
so
the one I was
really a topic that has a lot to be said about it. I'm not sure how much time we've got to spend on this anymore. Linda, if you have anything to say, could you keep it to 30 seconds?
Yeah, I was just saying that I was taught when I was referencing the due diligence, I was referencing those vendor delegated services.
Okay. Got it. And then we're going to move quickly on. We actually already spoke about licensing already. And so I think unless Lance and Linda, unless you have anything to add about the options for licensing requirements for third-party data, I think we can move straight ahead. But Lance and Linda, before we do that, do you have anything brief that you want to add around the licensing issue?
I'm good. Thank you.
I think we covered that earlier in the call. So
yes.
Hopefully managed to get some insights into that already. So we're going to move on to our penultimate question. How rigorous do you expect the regulators to be regarding reporting and compliance? Are we going to see a grace period, or do you think that they're going to crack down immediately? And Linda, I'm going to throw that back to you.
Yeah, I'm sure Dowd will have a much more clear opinion about this. I think personally, I think that obviously we have no way to be sure. However, I suspect that given all the concerns still being raised through the industry initiatives with ESMA, through the various industry groups, that the regulator will initially be looking similar to what I believe they did with MiFID, which is to ensure that the firms are going through the motions of actually reporting versus the content for the initial grace period. So, during an initial grace period. So even though they don't explicitly say that, we tended to see that that's how they were dealing with firms in the MiFID space. So back to the plumbing that I was talking about earlier, I think they'll want to see that the firms address the plumbing and are attempting to comply, and will give firms some time to address the data quality and reconciliation issues. And as Dowd mentioned earlier about everybody's kind of getting together and saying, well, this is how we're all going to agree to do it because of the lack of guidance. I think until ESMA can come out with stronger guidance in certain areas, it's going to be hard to do some of the enforcement early on. But I do think that they'll want to see the effort there.
Okay, Dowd.
Linda's absolutely right, 100%. I mean, we've obviously gone through this process multiple times now as multiple reporting regimes in Europe have come into place. From the people I've spoken to in the regulatory community across the NCAs and the European regulators themselves is concerned is what they want to see is efforts to comply on day one with the reporting regime. So the key is to get the reporting as good as you can. Now, all of the post-reporting pieces, like the pairing, the matching, the break resolution issues, can be addressed as a day two, really, because we'll do our best efforts there, but I don't expect to see any regulatory activity in that space. But from conversations with regulators, they have been very clear that firms that are in scope for reporting on the 13th of April had better start reporting on the 13th of April, full stop.
Okay, all right. Now, we've got a couple of questions from the audience that we're going to try and run through very, very quickly before we go to our last question. So the first one, I'm not quite sure who this is directed to, but I'm going to possibly say, Tom, are daily money market subscriptions and redemptions in scope for SFTR, even if these do not involve the reuse or reinvestment of repo proceeds? Tom, is that one for you, maybe?
No, I don't think it is. No.
Yeah, and I don't think they are. Right? I don't think they are in scope. But again, you need to talk to your compliance legal and go and maybe get some regulatory advice from an NCA, because we're not allowed to actually give regulatory advice. And also, when you say money markets, there, you'd have to be a lot more specific about the instrument you're looking at and what you mean by proceeds. So it all comes down to semantics at a certain point and how you define what a product is. And that, I think it was Tom said, or it may have been Linda, it was Linda actually said earlier, is that out of this process now that we get to, we'll see that the different models of booking that different firms use and different nomenclature they use to describe a product. And what one person calls a repo, somebody else might call a buy-sell back. Well, because of the way their systems work and the bookings they do, rather than necessarily what they've actually traded. And that will start to bubble up when we see the reporting.
Great. Well, now we've got a few minutes left, not very many, so I'm going to move on to the last question, which is to each audience member. If you could just speak for 10 or 15 seconds, what do you expect for the first 6 to 12 months after implementation? What are going to be the big issues? What are the pitfalls going to be to watch out for firms listening today? And again, please be brief because we're running out of time. But Linda, I'm going to pass that to you first.
I would say it's the reconciliation break. So I'm very interested to see how the metrics run on those. No one can predict what these numbers will look like, and I think it's going to come down to differences similar to what Dowd was just saying in how people represent and describe an instrument.
Okay, and Dowd, what about you?
Same as Linda. It's going to be the post-trade, post-reporting piece around pairing, matching, and then reconciliation, break resolution. I don't underestimate the amount of effort that's going to be involved in trying to define where that issue is, who's got the issue, as in which side is right and which side is wrong, and then how to fix it. That's going to be big.
And Lance?
I agree with that. I think it's going to be the break resolution, the amount of time spent in getting both parties to collaborate to address it. I think that's going to be an interesting challenge.
Okay, and Tom?
Well, I hope to see the fair amount of collaboration across the industry to resolve breaks. So in the vein of the previous comments, I also would hope to see a lot of advocacy and communication with the regulators and ESMA to make sure they're aware of what's going on and the challenges that we face. We need to make sure that we keep open lines of communication with them.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I think we just squeezed in under the time. So thank you so much for those insights to all of our speakers, and thank you to our sponsors, S&P Global Market Intelligence and SmartStream RDU, for making today's webinar possible. Before we go, just very briefly, I promised to give you some information about our upcoming events, the first of which is our flagship Data Management Summit 2020. Coming up on March 19th at the etc. venues in St. Paul's. This is always a brilliant event. You can sign up on our website at datamanagementinsight.com. Regarding the coronavirus issue, obviously we're monitoring that situation very closely with respect to the conference. As of now, I can reassure you that the event is still on, the speakers are still lined up, and we have a great registration list. But we're also working hard on plans behind the scenes to bring you a virtual data management summit. So any of you who are not able to make it on the day, you will still be able to gain access to a full virtual summit, and you'll still be able to get all of that content from your own home or office. That is followed on by the New York event in September at One Liberty Plaza. Hopefully this corona chaos will be over by then. And that's going to be another cracker. You can sign up on the website, and there's also a brilliant video on that website of last year's event, so you can get a feel of what's in store. We're moving on to RegTech in London on October the 1st, and then we have another RegTech Summit in New York on November the 10th. And finally, we hope that you've enjoyed today so much that you will join us again for some more of our upcoming webinars, which include best practices for creating a data quality framework, coming up very quickly on March the 24th, how to turn data lineage from a regulatory response into a business advantage on April 28th, and data standards and identifiers on the 7th of May. So finally, thank you very, very much to everyone who joined us today, and of course to our expert speakers, Lance, Linda, Dowd, and Thomas. Please, to all of our listeners, please do take the time to complete our post-webinar survey, and we will also let you know when the recording of this webinar is available in case there are any points you would like to return to. Have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for joining us, and goodbye.